Hey folks, welcome to a look at mapping scales for hex maps. I'm Joe Wetzel, the creator of Worldographer, and what you're seeing is a hex map created with Worldographer that's been actually drilled down a couple of different levels, and we'll get to that. Using our map levels feature in Worldographer, we had something prior in Hexographer called child maps, which was somewhat similar but not as dynamic. But whether you're using Worldographer or another tool or just on paper, most of this discussion will apply. So I should point out Worldographer doesn't really enforce or even suggest any scale. It's really whatever scale you want for that particular map. It's up to you to set the scale to whatever you'd like. But you want to think about the purpose of your map. So on the lowest level, we actually have also a province level map, which is typically a 1 mile across hex. And for our non-American friends, 1 mile is about 1.6 kilometers. So 6 kilometers is a little bit less than 10, or 6 miles is a little less than 10 kilometers, 9.6 or so to be precise, or more precise. And so for some purposes, like if you've just got a small province, or if you're just detailing the travel between a couple of locations in a single low-level adventure, a 1 mile hex might make good sense. However, as soon as you start getting to something like a kingdom size, or you want to show the kingdom and a couple of adjacent kingdoms, you're going to have a large number of hexes for that. That's a map of that purpose. For example, Pennsylvania is about 283 miles across by 170 miles tall, which is 46,000 square miles or so. And for Europeans, Britain is about double that size. Anyway, at 230 or 283 miles and 170 miles, you're going to end up with a map that's got a couple hundred hexes on each axis, which is not going to be easily printable or easily understandable when printed on a letter, or for our European friends, an A4 size paper. So if you want to, you can, print poster size. If you want to take, export as a file and take it to a print shop, or if you, somehow have access to a large format printer, by all means, that will work. You're still going to run into problems later. If you wanted to have a map of a continent or of a world at 1 mile a hex, you'd have to end up printing on several sheets of poster paper. And, actually that might be kind of a cool idea, is to have a whole wall of your world with, 6 or more pages of poster-sized pages taped together on your wall. But I digress. If you're using a digital tool as well, like this, it doesn't really matter. Your limit is the limit of memory, which, Worldographer has gotten a lot better with managing that, and it's going to continue to get better with some architectural changes we have planned. But you're typically able to do maps that are a few thousand hexes in each dimension, and if you've got a relatively modern computer. I work myself on I guess now it's a 1-year-old laptop, but it's still a laptop, and I have no trouble with a few thousand hexes by a few thousand hexes. But again, back to, a couple hundred hexes on each axis for a page of paper is not going to be a good fit. Not going to give you an understandable map. So that's why you go up to another level, which is typically called your kingdom scale map. And for this, there's a lot of good arguments for different scales: 5 miles per hex, or 6, or 8, or even 10. So we'll talk about each of these in a little bit of detail. But this is what Worldographer allows you to do, is to set your map levels and to drift down and up, and we'll show that off in a moment. So I personally have come around to the 6 mile hex idea, or I mean, sorry, for the 5 mile hex idea, and we'll get to that in a moment. But let's start with the 6 mile hex because that's actually got a little bit more momentum from what I read, and even though I have a preference, that doesn't mean that there's a right answer. That doesn't mean that if you've got a good reason for a different scale, and I'm going to talk about each of these, the good reasons for each of them. By all means, go with it. So the 6 mile hex, people are arguing, hey, you can see about 3 miles when you're on Earth. So if you're standing in the center of that 6 mile hex, you can see basically to each edge of that hex. And so that's one argument for it. The other argument is people generally walk about 3 miles an hour if the terrain is easy. Now, I personally, when I'm running on the treadmill and I cool down, I'm walking according to the treadmill at about 2.7, 2.8 miles per hour. But maybe I'm a little bit slower. Like I said, I am cooling down from a run. Or maybe the treadmill is not quite exact, but regardless, people will say that 3 miles per hex or 3 miles an hour is a good walking speed, and maybe they are talking about a brisk walking speed. However, if you think about it in your fantasy world, you've got a lot of smaller characters, so they're not going to be going at the same speed that a human does. The other argument that I would point out, and that leads me to my 5 mile hex idea, is that people don't, these trails aren't straight. So if you want to say, I'm traversing 1 hex every 2 hours of walking, which is what people will say for the 6 mile hex, is they can walk across that hex in 2 hours. And so if they know people are walking, they're doing an 8-hour walk day, kind of an easy march, or are they doing a forced march where they want to be trying to go, 12 hours? You can say that you're going, 1 hex per 2 hours of walking. Again, so I would argue, maybe 5 miles is a better scale to say how far you can walk, how many hexes you can walk in a day, or how many hexes. You can traverse 1 hex every 2 hours. If it's a 5 mile hex, would be where I would come in. And there are plenty of other people who agree with a 5 mile hex. It's also more easily divisible, or a multiple of numbers that are easy for us to count: 5, 10, 15, 20, 25, and so on. There's also some folks who will argue for an 8 mile hex because the party can walk 3 hexes a day. In that case, is what they would argue. Although, given the terrain, they might cut that down to 2 hexes or even 1 hex if it's particularly difficult terrain. So you could also use multiples of that. You could do like a 10 mile hex because perhaps, again, getting back to the paper size and making the paper look too busy. And speaking of too busy, maybe I'll zoom in a little bit on some of these so that your display isn't too busy. Anyway, so you might go with a 10 mile hex because you want to just double, or I guess half the scale, so that double the scale, so you can have the number of hexes in something that's printed out. If your original argument was 5 miles per hex, or if you want to say you wanted to do the 6 mile hex, but it ends up being too busy, you can go to 12 mile hexes. So those are some arguments for what scale you should use, or some suggestions and some reasons why you should use each of these different options for your scale for a kingdom map. And again, or if I didn't mention it, the kingdom map is kind of going to detail the area of a typical fantasy kingdom, as well as, of course, it's the border areas with a couple of other adjacent kingdoms, where you might get, 10 or 20% of the different adjacent areas. So that leads us up to, continent scale. So this is where we will have a number of hexes across per hex, or rather the kingdom has a number of hexes across per hex in the continent level. So we'll see that. So, you kind of see that here, where we've got, this hex here is showing, 5 hexes across here. So these are our kingdom hexes, these small ones, and this represents our continent level, where we've got, again, 5 across is what I had chosen when I kind of walked through this exercise before recording the video. And then this large hex that's spanning most of the display area is your world level, and we'll get to that. But let me bounce up to the continent level. And what you're seeing too is Worldographer, with its auto generation of the different view levels, it does just a direct mapping. That's what you're seeing. You're seeing so I like to smooth these out a little bit and change up so that the terrain isn't perfectly matching the area, and also you might want to put in some sort of a border area between terrains that don't quite make much sense. That algorithm does have some auto. You can, in the options up here on the top, you can add randomness to the terrain fills and children, and so that's why you end up with a little bit of these slightly different icons, where you might have some marsh in your swamp, or you might have a forested hill in the forest area, and so forth. All right, but back to the continent scale maps. So, if you're trying to display a whole continent, you want to, you're not going to want to do 5, 6, or 8 miles per hex. Again, unless you decide to print poster, or perhaps you want to just keep everything digitally, then you could. But typically, you're going to want to have another map scale. And so you're going to, and so one of the reasons here is if you think about it, if you want to try to display an entire continent, and continent is kind of just a name. It gives you an idea of what it's for, but if you have a supercontinent, then maybe you're only going to be showing a third of that continent when printed. And so if that's the case, because you can think about what's the distance from Boston to Seattle, it's a little bit less than 2,500 miles. So even if we had a kingdom level map on the larger scale of 8 or 10 miles per hex, we're going to end up with something like 250 or 300 hexes on each side, which again, on a single sheet of paper, that would be definitely pretty busy. Even on a poster, 300 hexes on a side would be, you got 36, the larger size of a poster, you got 36, subtract a little bit for margin and so forth, and do some rounding and stuff. You're going to get, 8, 9, 10 hexes per inch, which can still get kind of busy. So people will go with a larger scale, and the suggestions are to go to something like 25 to 35 miles per hex, because if you want to measure travel distance, again, this is a way to think, your healthy horse, according to various websites, can go about 25 to 35 miles per day. Now, again, for the same reason that I had mentioned before, is that trails aren't straight, so you might want to err on the lower side of that. Plus, if you think about it, not all your horses are going to be well rested every day and so forth. So I would argue, for the 24 or 25 mile hex at this level to show the distance that a horse can travel. Say that a horse can travel each hex in a day. And again, that's going to vary by terrain. If you start going through the swamp, well, maybe you're going to want to say that they can only travel through half a hex a day. It takes 2 days to get through that swampy area, for example, on horseback, where they're going to have to get off often and lead the horse and so forth. But you can go to 30 or 32, like I said. The websites do say that horses can go 25 to 35 miles per day, and so you're going to want to pick a number, though. That do we go with 25 or 24 is going to depend on what scale did we choose for our continent level? If we chose 5 miles a hex like I did, well, in this case, you're going to want to do, 25 or 30 miles per hex. If you went with the 6-mile hex, then you're going to want to do 24 or 30, or maybe even 36. So those are your options for the scale there. Now for our purposes, like I said, I'm saying that, let me bounce back down to the kingdom level here. I'm saying that each of these is, is a 5-mile hex. And then I'm saying that there's 5 of these per level. So I'm going with a 25-mile hex on the continent level. And again, like I said, I would smooth these out. This is just what's been auto-generated. I like to, I would add some more hill around these mountains and so forth. But now another factor to consider when you're doing this continent level is, do you have a desired print size? Again, if we have that 30-mile hex, a map of the U.S. would be, something like 100 hexes on a side. So that would get pretty busy. Maybe you want to double the scale to 50 or whatever is double what you had chosen. Go from 24 to 48, go from 25 to 50, go from 30 to 60. And then you're just saying, well, you can travel every day, or every 2 days to cross a hex on horseback. So that covers the continent scale. Now, for world scale, again, the two factors here that to consider is, what's the print area and how busy is it going to look, and what was the continent scale, and what do I want to, I want to have an even multiple of that. So if I picked 50 miles per hex for my continent scale, I might pick 250 at this scale for a 5-to-1 ratio. However, on a letter or A4 paper, that's going to be 100 hexes on a side. When you think about, the Earth's circumference at the equator is a little less than 25,000 miles. It's 24,901, I think. So if you have an Earth-sized world, and of course, if you want to, you're making a fantasy world, so you can make something smaller, something larger. But if you have an Earth-sized world, if I have 250 miles per hex at the equator, I'm going to end up with about 100 hexes on the long side, and then about half that. And we'll get to that because things get even more complicated if you really want to think this through. So, if you think that that's going to be too busy because you're trying to print on letter and A4 paper, you can, of course, double that scale and make it 500 miles at that scale. For a 10-to-1 ratio with your hexes on the continent level. However, again, actually, especially for a world map, you might plan on only printing it poster size, in which case 100 hexes would be fine. Or if you're going to keep it all digital, that's also an option. And I should point out with printing, especially with Worldographer, you do have an option here. You can export to PDF. And what this will do is it will set it up to your page size that you desire, and you can then set the number of tiles per inch, which in this case is the hexes, and it's going to span pages. So this might give me 6 or 8 or 10 or 12 pages to print, and then I would just stitch them together. So when I say that you can print to A4 or letter paper, that's another option if you don't have access to a large format printer. But anyway, as I was alluding to, though, it's actually a little bit more complicated. All this discussion is even more complicated when you think about the staggered nature of your hexes. And I'm going to bounce down to the continent level just because I like this view a little bit more. So the thing to keep in mind is that our distances across the hex from flat side to flat side is different from the distance from the point to the point. In fact, it's about 15% more point to point, 15.47005% more, it seems like. But we can say 15% or 15.5% wider. So our 8-mile hex, if measured from side to side, is going to actually end up being is going to be 9 miles when measured point to point. It's going to be over that. So that's one factor. And then the other factor, though, is to think about, well, we've got this staggered nature of the hexes, so that this column here indents a little bit with this column here, and that ends up adding actually an extra 15%. So or cutting back, actually, I should say, about 15%. If I measure 4 of these hexes vertically, and then I measure 4 of these hexes horizontally from this, starting at, say, this short side point here, long side, short side, long side, just so that evens out. This is actually, this width is about 15% less than the height, because of that staggered nature. Even though, because we've got this extra distance here, but then that's more than made up for by this short distance here. So if you wanted to size your world map properly, you need to kind of plan for having, if you've got your columns lined up, this is what we call a true columns or a columns line up perspective for your hexes. If your columns line up like this, then you're going to want to add, about 15% more hexes in the horizontal direction compared to what you have in the vertical direction. And of course, for the vertical direction, you're going to have half of what, so if my original plan was to do 100 hexes by 50 for my equator, then because I'm only showing, because of the way that we're going to unroll the world onto a flat sheet of paper, I'm going to do about half of that in the longitudinal direction. So I need to add, though, that extra 15%. So instead of going 100 by 50, I might do 115, or if I wanted even numbers, I might do 114, 116, whatever the case might be, in order to improve that accuracy. I should also point out that you've got, an extra half hex, too, on the top and the bottom, because, each column shifts down a little, each alternating column shifts down half a hex, so that ends up giving us an extra half hex in our vertical direction. Now, that happens at the poles, and it's only half a hex for that entire distance, so probably doesn't matter that much, especially when you consider map projections mucking this up even more. Like I've been saying, the Earth's circumference at the equator is about 24,900 miles. However, because the Earth is a sphere, at about 45 degrees north and south latitude, it's only about 17,638 miles. So if you, and that 45 degrees north latitude would run through like the middle of Maine, but, just south of Milan, Italy. So you've got quite a bit of area that's above that, and you can see that your scale is going to be quite a bit different. So our map, that might have a scale of, and this was what I was planning with this map here, that these larger hexes on this level represent, 250 miles per hex, because these others represent, or rather, no, let me take that back. So the lowest level, let me go back down to the kingdom level, and let's get back into so these, if these represent 5 miles, then we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, so we've got 25, and then we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Okay, so we're getting 150-mile hexes on the large sides. But regardless, that scale, that 150, is actually doubled at the 60 degrees north and south latitude. So, I mean, let me bounce back out to the world level to show that off. And let's zoom out as much as we can here to show kind of the whole map there, pretty close to it. So yeah, at our equator, it's just like what I described. I mean, it's 150 miles per hex. However, the scale up here, in the width dimension, I should say, not in the vertical dimension, in the width dimension, it's going to end up being 300 miles per hex, roundabout here. And of course, up here at the pole, it's going to be even more skewed. So it could, at that top row could be, more than 1,000 miles per hex. So, that also mucks this up. Now, we do have, for example, Worldographer, we have another map projection available. And so other map projections can make this easier. If I go with our icosahedral projection, for example, this just, gives us more accurate overall, but there's still, at the poles, it's going to be at the corners of the triangles that you kind of can visualize there. At the corners of the triangles, it's going to be a little bit different than at the middles of each of those triangles. But it is better, and of course there are other projections available that are even better. But some of them you want to vary based on where your land masses are, so you're only splitting in the ocean and so forth. But given all this, I mean, how accurate does it really need to be, your map? I mean, if you think about it, old maps weren't precise. Even after Magellan circumnavigated the globe, there were areas where the west coast of the United States the current United States was completely skewed, for example, and so you could always leave portions of your map unexplored. You could just say, hey, here be dragons, and leave them blank, and for a fantasy map, that might even be true. But even if you do have your world map and continent map that's fully filled in, like what I did here, where I had Worldographer auto-generate this map, and then I said, let's go ahead and build the continent map, and then let's go ahead and build the kingdom map from that. And again, I would smooth the area that I'm more concerned about, the starting area. I would kind of be tweaking the map. But you can always say that those other parts of the map, if you want to change them up later, were done by a cartographer who's not that reliable. It was based on copies of other maps, a combination of those. You could even say that there was some sort of catastrophe, and there was some sort of natural disaster, magical experiment or something that caused a major change. So, and that might be the source of an adventure itself. Is why is this part of the world so different? So that covers scale in quite a bit of detail. I hope that's been useful. I think that it really comes down to, for that kingdom level, do you want the 5 or 6 mile hex map? Do you want 8, 10? What logic do you believe for that? And realizing that your maps don't have to be exact; they can't be exact because of the spherical nature of your globe. Likely, again, I guess since it's a fantasy world, you can be living in a flat world. Yeah, you could have flat earthers who are right, and you could say that there's a sphere for earthers who are all wrong. Again, that could be another source of adventure. So that covers it. Again, thanks for your interest, and I hope this is useful and helps you make some good maps for your campaign.